Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second meeting of the Teach Grant Subcommittee. I'm glad that everybody had a safe trip here, and I guess we had a question over there. We are going to have a couple people, at least, that I know will not be here today. Debbie Braswell will not be here. She suffered an injury. I don't know, Debbie, if you're watching us, but get well soon. I hope you will be able to join us again. And also, our attorney, Brian Siegel, is not feeling well, so he is not here today either. Hopefully, he will be able to join us tomorrow. We shall see. But I just want to let everybody know, and we're waiting to see if Stephen Payne will join us as well. I hope everybody had an opportunity to look at the red line we had initially sent. It's different than the one we have here now, but we'll talk about that in a minute. We received some language as well that people provided. If it turns out that you had language that you did want to provide and you hadn't had a chance to provide it yet, just let us know during the day today, and we'll see how we can deal with that. Yes?
Is the language that folks sent in included within this red line?
No, it's not. It's going to be a separate. When we get to those pieces, we will put them up and talk about them, but they're not included in this red line because this red line had to be printed last week. So anything we got after that just didn't make it, which means none of them made it.
Okay, that's understandable. Could we also get a printed copy of any proposed language that was sent, just so we have it as we're keeping notes?
We have conversion language, and we got yours today, so we need to make copies of those too, and we'll pass them out as we need
great.
them, and
Thank you.
we'll also whatever we end up doing with that, we'll go as well. So, but that's a little bit down the road right now. So, I want to talk a little bit before we get to the substance of our work about what is supposed to be happening in this second session of our meeting and what we're about to do. So, just to clarify the scope of what the subcommittee does, our job is to create a recommendation to the main committee, the main negotiating committee, for Teach Grant proposals that will be effective down the road, July 1 of 2020. So our scope is going forward, not going backward. So issues that involve, say, current borrowers, those are outside the scope of our current charge. The same thing applies to any data requests. Data requests are to be related to our job going forward in the Teach Grant regulations, so meaning, again, related to those regulations that will be in effect as of July 1, 2020. I just want to make sure that's clear so that when we get into the meat of our proposals and how we're going to be working with this to present to the main committee and our proposal to the main committee, we're very clear on what our charge is and the recommendations that we're supposed to be providing.
I just have a quick question on that point. The notice that was issued related to the Teach Grant provisions did include backwards looking as well as forward looking recommendations. And so I'm curious about the department's position in terms of what you mean by only forward-looking, that this would not include.
So the regulations themselves that we are redlining and drafting are forward-looking regulations. They won't be even effective until July 1 of 2020. By the time these become effective, the other issues that go on with Teach, for example, the reconsideration process, those would be worked on and outside the scope of that because that's related to regulations. What we're doing is related to regulations going forward.
And I understand that the regulations would take effect in July of 2020. However, there could also be regulations that would also be retroactive that would still apply to current borrowers. It would just take effect in July of 2020. And so while I understand what you're saying, that these regulations will take effect in the future, the notice also included backwards-looking action. And so I don't think that the subcommittee should be prohibited from getting information about conversions that occurred in the past or considering remedies for current Teach Grant recipients.
While we note that and we understand that for the purposes of our discussion today, we will be looking to the regulations that are going to be going forward, and perhaps we can return to these questions at another date. But we have a very specific charge and very little time to get this ready for next week, so we are going to focus on those things that we see as the scope of the committee.
Will the department be responding to the data requests that have been submitted so far, even as they?
We are looking at them right now. I can't give you updates yet. I can give you some information, but we can't get these overnight, and people are looking at them to see what's gettable and what's not gettable. So the answer is maybe.
And while I understand that some of these data requests were submitted during the first session,
Right,
and it does pertain to what we're going to be discussing.
I totally understand
related
that,
to
but
these
we can't turn
regulations.
things around that quickly, and we are not even sure we have some data. So we have to be sure that we can respond in a way that's responsible, and that it provides, if we have data that provides accurate data related to the scope of what the work of the committee is.
Can you give me an idea of what some of the missing data is?
Not at this point.
Okay.
And we are now joined by Stephen. Welcome.
Hi there.
Morning.
We may want to update the roster because I was added on and I think they have an old version, so down at the desk.
To the end of talking about next week, what our charge is to provide our report out of our recommendations on the second day of the session next week of the main committee in the afternoon, 1:30 on Wednesday. So what I'm interested in finding out is who would be available and willing to present our work.
I am available, but I did receive notice last night that there will not be funding offered by the department for the travel considerations. Given how late it was announced when the subcommittees would be reporting back, I am disconcerted about paying out of pocket now a week out. Is there any possibility, especially because some of the other subcommittee members, we have a student, there's a student who is one of the reporting members in another committee, that being expected to pay would be financial hardship.
I was going to say, this is outside what I do, but we'll find out what the possibilities are.
Thank you. Have to check with someone else, but I appreciate it.
But otherwise, you're available and interested.
Yes, I am available and interested.
And are there other candidates for this?
I'll be joining Deborah, so AACTE, so no, I won't be available.
Yeah, same. I'll be at AACTE, so I won't be available.
Everybody's going to AACTE. Stephen, anything when you're in?
Yeah, could we confirm the date and time just one more time?
Yes, it would be on February 20th, which is a Wednesday at 1:30 in the afternoon. It's the second day of the May negotiating
Yes,
committee.
I can make that work.
Okay, great. So obviously, we will have to discuss, how this would work, but and any other structural issues. But since we haven't worked out the next set of red lines yet, I think that would come first. I just want to make sure that we have people in place so that as we're going through this, you can be thinking about how that might work, if that makes sense.
Can I just ask a question as we're going forward, because it pertains to how I'm sure we will both be taking notes during this period. Will the department also be representing their position on the proposed regulations, or will we be expected to assume those positions as well?
Remember that the way this works is that we are providing the committee's recommendations. So the department is part of the committee. So there will be, I don't know what we're going to result in, so let me put it that way. So we will either present some of the information, a recommendation that maybe everybody agrees on, and if there are multiple options for, we can't get there conceptually at one thing, then we would present what all the alternatives are, so that there isn't, there's no force of having to reach consensus here. That is not our job. Our job is to provide a recommendation. The main committee will be trying to achieve consensus, and they will be voting on whatever it is that we end up presenting or whatever they end up developing out of what we present. So we don't know down the road what the outcome is going to be. Our charge is simply to do the best we can to provide recommendations with respect to the regulations and the grant program.
And so if there are additional proposals that the committee agrees upon, but the department takes the position that it shouldn't be included or whatnot, we'll just represent the difference in opinion.
We would present whatever the alternatives are. So let's say there were two different alternatives for something. We would present what the alternatives are and just have that information as information to the committee, and then they will have to make a decision, the main committee, and then they would have to decide what they feel about that. We can only present what we can present, and we don't want to not represent an alternative that wouldn't serve the main committee.
Oh, absolutely. No, I absolutely agree with the presentation of all the alternatives that we all put forth. My only question is related to your earlier statement that these regulations should only be forward-looking and only should think about future operations of the program. If the committee does discuss alternate proposals, and those proposals should be represented as well because they have been brought to subcommittee discussion.
Let me take that back and see if how people feel about that. But for the purposes of our discussions today and tomorrow, we are planning to look forward.
Okay.
If I can make a request for those who will be presenting, that we really try to be disciplined about representing the committee and not our own individual clients or interests, because some of the conversation last time had been around individual clients and interests. And again, just I don't perceive that as appropriate, especially for the main committee.
I have a question. Do we know when the vote will be taking place? Is that something that is determined or?
No, we don't. And we don't know what will happen when we present in the main committee. So what I mean by that is we don't know whether they may ask us to do some more work on something. We don't know whether they'll want, we don't know what they'll want. It's one of those things that we just have to wait and see. So we will respond appropriately to whatever it turns out to be.
Thanks for clarifying.
Sure. Sorry, let's talk about, we got stuff on the board here, and we've got stuff that we handed out to you, and so let's just talk about what's going on with all this. So the red lines you see on the screen, just so you know, are duplicates of each other. One is the one that we'll be creating, and it will sort of create the historical record of what's going on. And what I mean by that is this red line that you see there has been overlaid to the last red line that we had done. What we had done previously and sent back to you, that particular red line. The department went back and we did several things. One, we tried to reflect back into the regs what we had heard and try to clarify language and do things that would make it consistent. Since we have a whole part, make it consistent with each other, if that makes sense. We didn't change anybody's concepts or anything like that. We just wordsmithed a lot of things. And then we did some things that just are just a natural part of regulations. The most obvious one, which comes up right away, is that, for instance, we now refer in the regulations to the FAFSA, but in no place have we pulled that definition in. What I call kind of cleanup stuff that needs to be in a reg that doesn't change anything. It's just that's the nature of how we write regulations. So we'll talk about those, and I'll point those out as we go through the regulations. So that's what you're seeing there. You're seeing two versions of it. One is going to keep whatever it is that we get to today, and we agree to today, on top of the overlay. So there'll be a consistent version of what we had done, what we had moved through. The other one is going to end up being the one that goes to the main committee, and is simply going to reflect what we come to today. It's not going to reflect all the various prior iterations that are now becoming numerous and difficult to follow on a red line. So we're just going to have one red line reflecting what we come out of after tomorrow. And we also have, for purposes of today, a clean version of this, which Aaron will pull up in a second, so that we can actually read these without everybody needing to go and procure new prescription glasses just to be able to read that. So we'll be able to read through what we're saying in the red line without all the redlining. It's going to be helpful in some places, in other places it won't make a difference. So the idea then would be that as we go through and get to places where we've gotten language from folks, we would then pull that up on the screen and then look at that individually, because as I said before, we had to have these printed last week, so it is what it is, logistics. Does that make sense? Then, okay. So the final product then that we would be working on to present to the main committee will be the red line, which will be just the red line from what's left over after tomorrow is done. Okay, good.
Sophia?
Yes.
Am I correct in assuming that the comments will be deleted before it goes to main committee?
Well, do you mean like where it says person this said that? Yes, those will be deleted. If there's any explanatory things that we feel should be kept, we can keep them in the red line that's going to the committee. Everything stays in the one version, but the other version, if there's some explanatory comments without names attached or anything else that people want to keep in, we can talk about that and then include that, because I think that can be useful if there was a lot of question about something, if people feel it needs to be. And it's really almost kind of as we go along, we'll have to figure that out if it even makes sense. But yeah, we're generally going to be trying to get rid of things so that it's as clean as possible and as tight as possible, which I think is what you're trying to get to, so that it's not one big confusing mess for the main committee to look at. We understand this, but if I hadn't been through all this process, I would have been like, what is all this, right? let me figure this out. I can't read all this. Where's the clean version? Any other questions before we turn to our work? Okay. So with that in mind, what we did, we'll start with obviously we want to go in order. And so for structurally, in terms of how to run this, my suggestion is that for those things which are not controversial, that everybody basically agrees on, we agree on the red line and then move on, because we're going to have plenty enough places where we're going to be having substantive conversation. And again, our time is very limited to get this product together. Does everybody feel like that would be a workable solution to getting through? Yeah.
One thing that I may submit to the group, and we've talked about this, I think, in the last session, but I think it would be helpful at some point to really think conceptually about what we're trying to do in terms of sort of a timeline of how things would look, particularly as we're thinking about notifications of information, but also the conversion points. And so I spent some time, and my colleagues back at NASFA had several conversations where we tried to put all of what we're trying to do in sort of a timeline and see, this is what we're doing here, this is what we're doing there. And what that allows you to do is think a little bit more conceptually about where the touch points are and what's important as we think about some of these ideas. As we go through sort of line by line, you sort of dive deep into the weeds of each particular section, but sometimes stepping back and trying to figure out exactly what we're trying to do may be helpful in certain places. So I just think that would have been helpful at the start of the first subcommittee session to really step back as a group and discuss before diving right into red lines that are now red, blue, and purple lines. But just something to throw out there as we think about particularly the later parts here, sort of the counseling piece, the conversion piece, and then if we get into a dispute piece, sort of how that all fits together into some sort of concept, because of course this would all have to be explained and communicated to students in some way as we go through. And so to the extent that we're able to clarify that process and think about it holistically, I think would significantly improve our product, particularly for those who may have to explain it to the full committee as well.
I concur. Because, Stephen, you're absolutely right. When I went back and talked to colleagues, all of it seemed great. from their standpoint. However, the details, the devil's in the details, and one thing that they were concerned about was when certain notifications would come out, when certain documents were due, and that timeline would highly impact. Whether this was a good possibility of good changes, or if it was more cumbersome. And so I totally agree. If we can consider that, I would definitely want to do that.
I turned it off. Did you have something you wanted to present to the committee, or?
No, I don't have a product with me, but I think that it would be helpful, particularly as we're thinking about the elements within some of the counseling items, just to say, here at 90 to 100, 120 days, as we have written right now, this would happen. Here at XYZ point, this would happen. I think that just clarifies things, because if you go line by line in the regulation, I don't want to take up too much time talking about this idea. I think everyone's sort of familiar with what I'm trying to say, but if you go line by line, you're jumping between here the notifications that are provided 90 to 120 days. Here is what's provided at conversion, and then you move into what actually happens. You know, you're sort of jumping around between the information pieces and the actual process piece. And so to the extent that we can kind of marry those together in our own conceptual thinking, that doesn't mean that's how we need to reorder everything here or should reorder everything here, but I think it could streamline the process as we're having a conversation.
Could we begin with that, even the timeline of here's when everything happens? I mean, we do have a whiteboard to draw it out so that we can reference it later as we're going through each of the regulations.
Yeah, I would love to do that. I'm definitely a visual thinker person as well, so that's helpful for me, of course. But I think that would be really helpful as we're thinking about it, and it can kind of be a living timeline that we can, as we think about all of these different pieces, can put together. But of course, defer to the group's thoughts there.
I think we're all kind of, I don't know, outside of the department, we'd all say, there's a whiteboard. Sure. Go.
So, Stephen, I think you've been nominated to.
I do have
Imagine that.
my own version, but not necessarily. It's not ready for prime time, but I can. We can get it up there. I don't know what time or at what point we want to do that. There's certainly other issues here, like highly qualified and some other things that are kind of absent.
I think it would be helpful. I mean, you've brought it forward to have this in our minds, and so
Yeah.
rather than not, I think we should do this now
Sure.
to lay it out and then head on down the road.
Great. I'll sort of say that we started at the conversion point as a sort of way to think, you know, both sides of it as we're thinking about it. Right now we have an annual notification piece that we thought about, so it's sort of living absent of this timeline to some degree. The 90 to 100 days prior to conversion notification. And then we have sort of a TBD dispute process on the other side, and that's something that I know Kira sent out to the group, and we have, that's, I know, something that we plan to discuss at some point, hopefully. So that's kind of out here. And then from there, you can kind of see that as we thought about it, if what we did was sort of final, that it's a little gray in terms of, thinking about, one thing that we talked about is particularly as we're thinking about ensuring that a grant recipient has time to provide documentation to ensure that a conversion doesn't occur, that, should we add additional language there, thinking about perhaps like 30 days prior to conversion, there would be a deadline for the grant recipient to submit information, just so it's very clear, sort of the points along the timeline. That's just an idea I'd throw out to the group. But providing a notification 90 to 120 days prior to conversion, and then, sort of leaving it up in the air before conversion is something that I would be a little concerned about, just from the standpoint of what are the expectations for both sides. And I know that it's the department isn't always gung-ho to say the department has to respond, and I understand where they're coming from on that to some level. So maybe there's as I suggested, maybe a 30 days prior to conversion, some sort of documentation deadline that the recipient knows, look, I'm being provided 90 to 120 day prior notification. And then at this point, I need to make sure that I get in any information that can change the trajectory here toward conversion, I think would be helpful. And that was the way we tried to get at not specifically requiring the department to respond in an X amount of time or something like that, X number of days, but providing a deadline for which the grant recipient can provide documentation that would, in their mind, perhaps dispute the conversion. And then from there, I guess the group can consider if that suspends conversion until all of that is finalized or considered. But at the very least, when you put it up on the timeline here, and folks feel free to add any points, but there's really not a whole lot here as we're thinking about touch points and checkpoints with students, other than we have an annual notification and the 90 to 100 day prior notification, the way that I read it.
Can I add that
Yeah.
to the, thank you.
So this is good to put up, but I think we will hold this discussion
Yep, that's
until we
fine.
get to it at the appropriate time in the regulations, since we have actually done some work in this area too.
Good.
That I don't know that anybody's had a chance to look at yet, since you
Yeah.
just got it.
Yes, of course. And I think that, we and as we said, we don't particularly, we're starting with the scope and all of these other issues, but as we go, hopefully we can work from this and continue to make maybe
Yeah,
modifications.
and this is a good idea to use our little whiteboard.
Yeah.
In addition to what Stephen just added in talking about the back end, I think on the front end, when you talk about application and receipt, as well as the advisement piece in between that, I think those are some other areas that we might want to put on the front end, because that seemed to be a huge part of where some of the error on the back end occurs. So if we can also consider that. And
I did submit some language for conversion counseling. I'm sure we'll get to that when we.
Yes,
when we
yeah,
get
I'm
there.
doing them systematically so we can lock down the regs as we're going down the road.
I'm just saying, I think we need to make sure we include that as part of the overall outline too.
I'm also going to add the annual notifications that we discussed that the department will be providing to recipients every year, just so we can have that here.
Yeah, I sort of left it floating there.
Yeah, okay. So then, let's just say 1, 2. I'm just going to leave this very large because we may have a lot happening in that period. Okay. Is there anything else that we need to add to the diagram that either the student will be expected to do or the department we've proposed that the department will do?
One thing I missed is at conversion there is some counseling, and that's what Alyssa
Okay.
was talking about too.
6.5.
Let's see.
Great. And then as we go, hopefully we can use the concept and really make sure that our proposal is as cohesive as possible as we're thinking about all the individual parts.
Thank you. All right. Having said all that now, let's move to our discussion of the regs in order. And again, the idea would be where there isn't much concern or dispute to save our time to as much as possible for those pieces which may be may have more discussion associated to them. So we're going to start with subpart A, scope, purpose, and general definitions. And if we could move to the clean copy so that you can read it actually, I think that would be very helpful. We took everything, just by the way, we took and either used the language that we had developed from last time or made minor tweaks to it so it would hold together with the rest of the regulations. In all cases, we tried to keep the concept. So this is what we have at this point, and this is the whole thing, not just the red lines. Teach Grant Program awards grants to students who intend to teach to help meet the cost of their post-secondary education. In exchange for the grant, the student must agree to serve as a full-time teacher in a high-need field in a school serving low-income students, or as a full-time teacher in a high-need field for an educational service agency serving low-income students for at least 4 academic years within 8 years of ceasing enrollment at the institution where the student received the grant, or in the case of a student who receives a teach grant at one institution and subsequently transfers to another within 8 years of ceasing enrollment at the other institution. The 8-year period for completing the required 4 years of teaching does not include periods of suspension in accordance with Section 686.41. If the student does not satisfy the service obligation, the amounts of teach grants received are treated as federal direct unsubsidized Stafford/Ford loan, direct unsubsidized loan, and must be repaid with interest charged from the date of each teach grant disbursement. A teach grant that has been converted to direct unsubsidized loan cannot be reconverted to a grant unless the secretary determines that the grant was converted to a loan in error.
I'm okay with it, however. The way that this reads to me means that they can reset their 8-year requirement by transferring, meaning if a student stops out from my institution for 2 years, normally that service obligation period would begin, but this says, or within 8 years of ceasing enrollment at the other institution. So I just want to make sure, I mean, I'm okay with it. It's very student-centric. I just want to make sure that that was the intent.
I think this was referring to the transfer student issue. And so it would be probably the situation where we would want to look at, I guess I'm trying to think, what would you put instead?
I mean, we could keep it that way as long as everybody's under the impression that it would reset that clock obligation.
I mean, I think I like.
Louder today.
Yeah. I appreciate the student-centric nature of that change, but I don't think we have the full transfer regulations in what was provided to us so far. I know we were talking about it, but there is a specific regulatory section just dedicated to
I do think that we probably
transfers.
do need to get what your point is clarified so that, yes. But I'm trying to think what we would put in there.
Isn't it without break in enrollment?
So where are we? In which line?
Well, I mean, without.
We don't have a full description of 68624, which is a transfer student attendant at more than one institution during an award year, which would cover students that transfer. I think we were discussing students that had a break, and I actually can't
Yes,
remember
that's in a different section.
Yeah.
And we'll get to it. I guess what I'm trying to figure out is what do we need to put in here to, or if we make a note, we can take it back and we can look at it later, which is probably what we should do.
I think we'll have to align it back to whatever we ultimately decided
Right.
with regards to the start or stop of the 8-year clock if there's a break in.
Yeah,
in
and we do
enrollment.
have language with that, so it's kind of down the road. So let's make a note to, yeah. So we will add language to clarify the transfer issue in some way, depending on how we word it down the road. I also wanted to note that there were some questions about maternity leave, how we treat a student who has graduated against a graduate program 1 day later. We wrote back and said these points are addressed outside of scope and purpose. But in response to the questions, dropping to less than half-time status does not trigger the start of an 8-year period. It's only if you cease enrollment completely. As to maternity leave, unless a student qualified for an approved leave of absence as defined in our regulations, which is generally not possible in a traditional standard term program, the student or the grant recipient would have to be reported as withdrawn, and that would start the 8-year clock. However, the recipient would qualify for an FMLA suspension. Finally, in the case of a student who completes an undergraduate Teach Grant eligible program and then begins a graduate program the next day, the school would have to report the student's enrollment status as graduated for the undergraduate program, and that would start the 8-year clock. However, if the graduate program is also Teach Grant eligible, the student could receive a suspension of the undergraduate service obligation period while enrolled in the graduate program. So even though these pieces are not part of scope and purpose, those questions were raised there and wanted to provide some sort of answers to these things as applicable. Okay. So we will go back and we will consider some language for that piece. Otherwise, with the exception to that, is the language acceptable to the group? Okay. Let's move on to the next. And we want to go to the next red line. There it is. So this is an example of what I was talking about before, where we have added language to the regulations because we need to have them. Under B, we have definitions for the following terms are used in this part are in subpart A of the Student Assistant General Provision Regulations, part 668. What's been added here is the FAFSA, which we then discuss later as the application for the Teach Grant program. So it's a simple matter of adding FAFSA to this. That's why we have it there. Questions?
I'm not sure if anyone else had struggled with this issue when they were thinking of draft language, but should we also add a term in here to define the Teach Grant eligible programs? Because it does become a term of art as we're discussing it. And we did have that issue the last time where we were struggling with what to call the program that a person receives a Teach Grant for.
There is a definition of a Teach Grant eligible program. It exists. Is that what you mean?
So I mean the shorthand. Would we refer to it as a Teach Grant eligible program throughout?
It's a term. So if it's referred to in the regulations, then it would refer to that term.
Okay, let's, yeah, okay.
We are now calling it the agreement to serve or repay. So we had to reflect that and get rid of ATS because ATS no longer reflects agreement to serve or repay. Stop me if if there's any question about that. Then we went to the Educational Service Agency, and here there's a comment which you can't see there, but we were asked to cite the law for that. And the law is under the definition of the Educational Service Agency is in 20 U.S.C. 7801-18. So it should be in your. Okay. And then the other thing we did, which again, this is kind of just a nit, is that we spelled out local education agencies, whereas we had previously just had LEA. So these are just nits that, we want to make sure to get right because we'll have to do them sooner or later anyway. We might as well just do them now. Questions? Doesn't look like any. Okay. All right. So the next one is this issue of highly qualified. So we have the question about adding the educational service agency here. We struck that language here because we don't need to add it here because it's already would be subsumed under public schools. So in the interest of having a tight regulation, we actually got rid of that there. And then the question had come up about whether we could modify this language of the highly qualified, and we cannot. If our attorney was here, he would, I would lob this question to him, but essentially we cannot. And then the other piece of that is that we are required to use it by statute. So we're caught on that one. There's just not much we can do with that. It is what it is. Yes, I knew that was going to be a question.
So I am concerned about the administrability of this program as states are not required to define highly qualified, and they may not be required to have teachers take any certification test or licensing examination. Like now it is all subject to states how they define what is an effective teacher. And so I was just wondering if the department had any additional insight into how the Every Student Succeeds Act has changed how states are certifying teachers.
Not sure how this directly relates to the issue of we have to use the terms highly qualified. States are also under the Every Student Succeeds Act. So I think we have to keep those things separate for the time being because of the fact that we have no option here. I don't know if that makes sense.
So that does change then what information we would relay to students, because there may be some states, if their certification rules change, that would be ineligible to teach in certain states, period, because there would not be a licensure test to be certified and to teach in that state.
Do you have a state that doesn't have a licensure test? Because I mean, I haven't heard that rumble through our community that people are, the standards are changing, but how a state defines effective teacher does not necessarily change their licensure and certification requirements. Now, they would have to go through the legislature and a number of changes there. So it's more, I hear what you're kind of asking, I think, but it's not that there are states that will allow people to enter the classroom without being fully certified, and they don't necessarily term that as highly qualified. So this is trying to set the bar for where you need to be in being fully licensed and certified. And I understand too, we can't change this definition at all because it's required in actually the Every Student Succeeds Act. It laid down this definition for us.
So as I understood it, it maintained highly qualified in a very limited subset of statutes while repealing it from what the states had to follow, correct?
It repealed highly qualified throughout many. Yeah, it kept it in various HEA, and they didn't maintain the highly qualified as previous. This is the NCLB this is the definition, and they've left it in place. So we can't change this because it's in statute.
Right, but states may not be required to define, to even ask their teachers to be highly qualified to teach in the state.
Correct, but the two are separate because they still have to meet these requirements. To be teacher grant eligible, then they have to meet the requirements in highly qualified as it is in statute. And if a state doesn't they're not going to use the term highly qualified, but how they define effective teacher could include these things or not. I mean, that is the freedom to the state, but the teach grant recipient needs to meet the standards that are in the statute. So, and it doesn't, although the term highly qualified is here for this purpose, you could tick it off as being an effective teacher in a state. Like a state may define it that way.
But there is the possibility that in the future, as state legislatures change their certification process, et cetera, that there would be certain states where a Teach Grant recipient would not be able to teach because now the state certification process would not comport with this definition. Is that right? Or I mean, I'm just concerned that now there's the highly qualified is no longer a federal standard that states are obligated to comply with. So because there can be so many changes from state to state, there could be a set of circumstances.
I think you're getting caught up on the words highly qualified because in this definition, it does talk about the teachers obtain full state certification as a teacher. And so it's up to how the state chooses to certify and license a teacher. So if you're transferring between states, we had this conversation about reciprocity. As these licensure agreements, or as licensure certification changes, it could change reciprocity, but that's sort of outside of Teach Grants anyway. That is something that just exists off into itself. But the words highly qualified, although this is defined for the Teach Grants, as you read the definition, it is, things that I think we all agree we would like teachers to actually be and have. And so it's not that the state certifies somebody as highly qualified, it's just you meet these qualifications, which includes, certification. So
your
I
position
don't-
is even though there's been this statutory change, it should not create an issue with the Teach Grant implementation. Okay.
I don't see one, and nobody brought one up to me. Is it brought up to, I think, either of that? Okay.
No, but going back to your point, Deborah, if someone were to change states, are they recognized, once they've been recognized highly qualified, are they still highly qualified?
I don't think we recognize them as highly qualified.
Well,
So
if they follow all of what is described here as highly qualified, if they finish from a program that deems them highly qualified in one state, when they start employment in another state, even though they have to go through a process, are they still highly qualified?
I still would argue let's not use the words highly qualified. If they're licensed or certified in a state and they move to another state where that licensure and certification is either immediately accepted or is accepted upon taking a test or something, then they're meeting the requirements in this definition. So it would still work, as long as they're also teaching in their field and teaching in a high-needs school.
Other discussion, or can we move on from highly qualified, or to another part of highly qualified, I should say? There was a question or an ask for including the term nonprofit under 4I, which was cited to go through language referring to loan cancellation for certain public service, and we did edit that to reflect that, as you can see. And then there was another question on whether we would think it was a good idea to release sub-regulatory guidance regarding individuals that take a state exam that is not recognized in 5 or more states, and we agreed that that would be sub-regulatory and not a regulatory issue. Okay. So the next red line that we have is under the school or educational service and agency serving low-income students. And if for this one, we basically didn't do anything. This is the same language that was there before. So I'm assuming everybody's still good with it. And then moving along to the next red line. So here we talk about the teacher shortage area listing, the nationwide list down the road, but we don't have it in here defined, so we defined it. We created a definition for it. Good.
Along those lines, this, just seeing the list, triggered our conversation about the teacher shortage areas the last time. I would like to propose that the department issue a list of the high need positions that qualify under the Teach Grant, so that it is unequivocally clear, because there was the confusion about what positions did qualify as high need during our last discussion.
I'm not sure I follow. The list of the nationwide list is the teacher shortage areas as defined by states. And that is different than the statutorily, already statutorily valid teaching areas, math, science, et cetera. Those are statutorily required. This specifically refers to the shortage areas that as states define them. So they're not really the same things.
But while I understand that this is the list of state-specific high-need areas, during our discussion last time, there are states that may present all high school positions as being high need in that state that would not.
Well, we can
count.
talk about that as we go down. We have some other language with that down the road. This here is strictly to define this piece. That's all that to use later.
Right.
But we will talk about that piece when we get there.
So then I would like to flag that there should be a list specific to the Teach Grant for administratability. Oh, I butchered that word. Purposes. That we should not be relying on this list. There should be a separate list that is just the high need areas for Teach Grants. Period.
But that list changes annually, and so we wouldn't necessarily have it in legislation, but what we could do is have a link to or have a clearer connection to what that nationwide list is. Because right now
You mean
we
like
just
a
say
website?
right now we just say Secretary, the annual published nationwide list. If there was a location and or a specific document that we are talking about, I think we should reference that there.
But this list is over-inclusive, and there are things that are included in this list that would not count as a high-need area under the Teach Grant, the way that we've discussed it. And so this list is confusing for teachers to look at when they see that a position is high need, but then it doesn't count towards their service obligation under the Teach Grant. So even if it changes every year, the department could still be publishing an updated list using this as a basis, because I assume the department also relies on this for other regulatory issues, but that the department could create a clear list of all of the qualifying high need areas in each state for the purposes of the Teach Grant, because there are these additional restrictions.
Kira, you're correct, because we've had candidates that have looked at the list by the state or the national list, understanding or thinking that they qualified only to find out that they didn't later. And that was why I was thinking that there would be a clearer list that is that gives you the specifics to this particular Teach Grant that would be published annually. Is that not correct, Sophia?
I'm a little confused, because if a state declares that all of they are in this desperate need and it's all the way up through, then the state, because by law they have to, that then becomes a high needs field in the state, and it has to be recognized. And it sounds like that's something that would actually fall under a different process here of a question of dispute on whether or not you're meeting those particular needs. I don't know if a state has declared that, say, K-12 is in everything is needed, but in that particular case, the department can't say that that's not true, and they can't say that that doesn't count for the Teach Grant. If I'm understanding correctly,
But they have, and I was I was citing that the last time because elementary is a shortage area in Virginia. However, you can't use the Teach Grant for elementary in general. And so that was a area of contention from some of our candidates in the past. And I thought we had come to a understanding that the nationwide list would be specific to those that the federal government has already identified only as shortage areas from the federal standpoint. I thought that was what, because we
It's already
said
defined
we had
in statute.
we had
what
two
the federal-
we had two lists that we were talking about last time. There was a nationwide list as well as the state list that seemed to be different.
I think we're in agreement that it needs to be a clearer list. The question of how to make it a clearer list is an open issue because this list still encompasses positions that don't qualify. Is that right, Mr. Walter?
And
If we're talking about the same list that we looked at last
Right,
week,
that
or
federal-
last time.
the federal
Yes,
list.
correct.
I would also like to put on the table that, and we discussed this last time, but just as a refresher, that there is specific language in statute that says another field documented as high need by the federal government, state government, or local educational agency and approved by the secretary. And this is the conversation where we had the conversation about the department sort of narrowing that list, and maybe they have additional flexibility.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful when we say federal list and national list because that does confuse things. As Stephen pointed out, there's specific statutory language, STEM, special ed, English language learners, but there's also, and that was the conversation, was what is actually encapsulated in the national list and around the flexibility that is or is not utilized.
I would also, just an additional complexity that I did hear from teach grant recipients on the ground who are attempting to report a high need area, which they have to write in on the FedLoan paperwork without any indication of how they're supposed to write it in, is that there are teachers I've heard from who got their degree in behavior analytics or things that are not clearly falling within one of our categories or one of the categories listed. Or are a general education teacher with a majority of special education students in their classroom, how to draw the line about what teaching positions qualify when you get into the nitty-gritty of what that specific teaching position is also becomes very complicated if the high need area is not sufficiently defined in the list, which it is not currently.
And Deborah, are you saying that if it's listed here as published, the annual published nationwide list, if it appears on that list, then there is no debating as to if it is a teach grant?
No, I wasn't saying that.
Okay.
I actually have not had time. I have a copy of the list with me, but I have not. I know you guys are surprised, but I have not looked through it. I think that was last time we were gathered together. I was really digging into how much input the state had into that national list because I was trying to wrap my head around the statute ability to have those state-specific and even LEA-specific. And the key word there is as approved by the secretary, as Stephen just read. And so that is something that maybe, whether it's in this regulation or later, we, outside of the scope of this regulatory work, we engage on really seeking clarification.
Did the department get clarification about the differences between the PDF copy of the teacher shortage list and the electronic copy?
So that's another area where we're currently engaged in follow-up with that. It's taking some time for people to take a look at these things. I will update you when I have that information. I don't have it yet.
Do you anticipate having that ready before we meet with the main committee?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
It's out of my purview.
And did the department have any thoughts on the conversation that we had?
Well, we will talk more about this later. We have continued. We went back to the original language that we had in the original regulations, as we had been requested, since people thought that was clearer. But we did not expand the scope at this point in time. If that's what you mean, relative to that language. Is that what you mean?
No, but I am curious about that and what.
Well, and I think, and then we will talk about it. But I want to keep things going systematically so that we stay on track, because again, I'm watching our time, and I know how much we have to cover, and we don't have a lot of time to do it.
So I'm just wondering, Sophie, if we need to just stop after the statute instead of the state reporting annually and all of that, since if we just stopped at shortage area nationwide listing, a list of teacher shortage areas in each state as defined under.
We can think about that. Aaron, let's strike that language. States report annually their proposed shortage areas, that sentence, and we'll go back and look at it and see if there's any legal issues if we did that.
But I'd also like to flag that we do not have consensus on using the teacher shortage area nationwide list, even as a definition, that we may come back and change this later, because I think we've all identified issues with that list as it currently exists.
Just
But it's
to
statutory.
kind of bring that home, I was counseling a student, I can't remember exactly the year, but I think it was probably around 2015, and Pennsylvania hadn't even submitted any at that point. So when we went to refer to this list, there were none in the entire state. So I think that without some sort of formal guidelines for the list itself, meaning deadlines for states to report and some communication when they don't report, that we're always going to have issues when trying to use this list. And that's probably one of the reasons also why the PDF was different than the published list, because it seems like you can add, because we fixed it. We did get some programs added to the list, so our teachers stopped freaking out. But I mean, I think that just kind of highlights the difficulty that people are experiencing.
And just to point out, this is a regulatory issue. While the states, localities, and nationwide list is defined, the department ultimately has authority to approve or not the areas that are put forth by those entities.
Is it possible for the department to at least get us some information about when you're asking the states to submit this information, if there is a deadline, and to whom it's submitted in the state?
Can I
if
add
it goes
to
to
your
the chief
In
states, like who gets the paperwork, who gets the notice from you all that, hey, you've got to do this? Sorry for the
Yeah, I understand.
so that we at least have a sense.
Can I add to your request? And if changes can be submitted, and if so, how is that communicated?
Yeah, we can find that out.
Thank you.
Let me just write this down so I don't forget. So we want to write down that we're going to get information on the schedule for reporting by states to the department, who gets the request to report, and who actually reports. I mean, they may not be the same. Good point.
And is there
And
the
then can states make changes?
Yes.
Yeah. I just want to make sure that's captured here in the.
And I'm going to add to my own request now. And how is that communicated to this end result communicated to the servicer?
By end result, do you mean the changes, or do you mean in general?
The list
The
or
list itself.
The list itself, and if there are changes, when the changes are communicated to the servicer.
Let's add all that.
It also brings up a, let's say, if there is a school or an area that is listed in a given year, and 4 years later when that student finishes or is ready to serve, and there are no schools and or that particular field is not still represented.
that's in there? Yep.
That's covered.
Yeah, we had statutory language actually to cover that. So.
It doesn't want me to speak. Schedule for reporting by states to the department. who gets the request, who actually reports to the department, and can states make changes, and how is that communicated to the servicer?
And the schedule on the changes, right? Is that what your piece? Great. Thank you.
That finishes definitions, so we'll be moving to Subpart B, application. There was a question, FSA should annually update it information and consumer test on Teach webpage. We agreed that it is reasonable to provide annual updates as necessary, and we believe we've updated our webpages to reflect correct information. So what we were trying to find out was whether there was something specific you were referring to. Do you want to think about it and get back to us, or?
I know what I was
Oh, okay.
referring to at the time. I would. Some of it is subject to the changes related to these regulations. At one point in, I believe, the agreement to serve, and potentially the entrance and exit counseling, there are statements that there is no dispute process, that once a grant has been converted, it cannot reconvert back. That is not accurate. And so that would be one place where the information available should be changed. Also, the forms related to annual certification or any certification forms that Teach Grant recipients are required to publish are not on the FSA website currently, and are behind a wall. You can find them via Googling and FedLoan, but they should be more readily publicly available to Teach Grant recipients so that it is obvious to them exactly what forms they need to complete to comply with the program.
I don't know the answer to the forms question.
Are you talking about going forward?
I am talking about
Yeah.
I am talking about going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think right now what we found was that one of the forms they have is outside the firewall and the other one is behind the firewall, and I don't know why that should be the case. There's some variation among servicers when it comes to loan program forms. Some of them make them available. I don't see why we couldn't make whatever forms come out of this available more easily to people. Should we?
I'm glad to hear that. In the same way that, the IDR form is already on the FSA website, it's
Correct.
in both places, and it just makes it easier.
Right, and we have, loan deferment forms are available in other places too. I don't see any reason that that can't be. I can tell you, though, we have had some issues sometimes with forms being out there and then people pulling them down and using them for the wrong purpose and sending them to the wrong place. So there is kind of a potential downside sometimes to making them too easily available. But as a general matter, I don't see any reason why we can't make whatever forms come out of this more easily available to people.
Great, thank you.
Will do. All right, thank you. Okay. So we have a comment that we made here that we just made slight modifications to the language in this paragraph. If you want to see the clean copy version of it, this is just to make it, read properly within the context of the actual regulations. So we will need to just find the clean version so you can read it clean. Okay. So to receive a grant under this part, a student must complete and submit the FAFSA in accordance with the instructions in the FAFSA, complete and sign agreement to serve or repay in accordance with 686.12, and provide any additional information requested by the Secretary and the institution. So we just cleaned that area up because it was, to us anyway, easier to read this way.
Just to the folks who are going to be presenting this to the larger committee, if you could kind of add the explanation that the way this is administered at institutions can vary. For instance, at my institution, we don't indicate eligibility to students. They need to apply. So there is a secondary step at my institution, but at other institutions, they're reviewing their students and just kind of saying, hey, you're eligible for this. You can accept it if you want to, but you don't have to. And that's why I think it's important to have that and at the institution in there as an available administrative tool.
Yeah, a little bit more slowly because I'm taking notes as you're.
I talk fast, I'm sorry. Just that I think it's an important piece to highlight for the larger committee as a whole, that just those three small words and the institution are very important in order to provide proper administrative tools based on the way the program is administered at different institutions.
And just to make sure I have a complete understanding, so some institutions will issue the grant following eligibility on the FAFSA, whereas others require an application first in a.
Right. So some institutions will review their population of students to figure out who, at least on the surface of things, looks like an eligible student. And then just like we have active and passive confirmation for loans, they would say, okay, yes, I do want to take advantage of that opportunity. And then they would process the Teach Grant. Other institutions may, obviously it's available on my website. We counsel students that it's something available if they want to use it. But quite frankly, it has been very problematic. And quite frankly, a lot of them do end up as loans. And so we don't want to. As soon as you show student money, they're more likely to say yes rather than consider all of the details first. So we feel that at our institution, we try to make them consider all those other pieces first. We certainly award Teach Grants to both our undergraduate and graduate population. We just feel that having that application step is an important piece for us and our demographic. And there's multiple schools that do it in both of those categories. So we're not strange, and neither is the school that just shows eligibility either.
Are you aware of how many Teach Grant recipients from your school have had their grant convert? Do you get?
No, I've never requested that data. I mean, there has been a few because they've come back and
Sure.
discussed that with me. But I can't say that that's an inclusive number because I would never know
Sure.
unless they communicated that to me.
Okay.
Okay. So in B, we just have the language that complete and sign the agreement to serve in accordance with 612.12 and provide any additional information. You can see we struck and assurances because that doesn't really add anything because the assurances are all in the agreement to serve already. So we were just trying to, again, clarify the regs to be tight and clean. And that takes us to eligibility to receive the grant under 686.11. Here, we just did one thing, which was to strike the word described. If we go to the clean version, you can see why we did that. Which would be, it's actually double, it's actually I at this point. So if you go back up the other way, go back, yeah, back, yeah. So basically, all we're saying here is that if the student has met the application requirements in 686.10, just no, it's kind of easier to just say that. Questions about that? So our next one that we have redlined to is B, current or former teachers or retirees. We'll just have to give a second to scroll there. Yeah, no worries. Right there. So here we just struck the FAFSA because it's already a requirement under 6.10, so there's no need for it to reappear there. And also, for the same reasons as described before, we struck the word described. So this is, if we want to look at the clean version of this, to see what it looks like. Under B, current and or former teachers. It's okay. Yeah, it's current or former teacher. Yeah. It's a little bit down. Or former. It's current or former teachers. You have of.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. So it would just read under B, current or former teachers, a student who has met the application requirements in 68610 and meets the requirements of 34 CFR Part 68, Part C is eligible to receive the teach grant. So it's just really, tightening up the language. That's all. And then similarly, I should probably note this now so I don't have to keep repeating this. Under has signed the agreement to serve or repay. Everywhere we found that, we added that language. If we missed something and you spot it, let us know. But I think we got them all. I think there were like 49 of them or something. I know it was a lot. Okay.
Just on that note, is there any possible way that you can change the name of that now?
In what way do you mean?
Stop calling it the agreement to serve immediately and begin calling it the agreement to serve or repay? Like tomorrow?
As in, we don't have any authority right now.
I just had to check. I just had to check. That's probably one of the simplest, yet, at least in my mind, most effective ways to communicate the importance.
So let's move now to the agreement to serve or repay, which is 686.12. Are those mine? Oh. Well, no, don't. These are different.
Those are? Okay.
These are from before. These are from the last time.
Okay, those were sent downstairs. Okay.
Oh, yeah, I did. But they were?
Do you need these?
No.
No, okay. No, I'll just
No,
take
those are the old ones, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
Okay.
Everything else okay?
Thank you. All right. So here we have quite a few things. I'm watching our time here. I want to make sure we get a break at 10:30-ish. So here we kind of just did a little bit of wordsmithing. You can see a bunch of redlining there, but if we ultimately look at the clean version, so the contents of the agreement are serve to repay. Under, we go, provides that, the agreement provides that for each teach grant eligible program for which the student received teach grant funds, the grant recipient must fulfill a service obligation by performing credible teaching service by serving as a full-time teacher for a total of not less than 4 elementary or secondary academic years within 8 years.
Can I actually ask a question? So I caught this when reviewing some of the proposed language. The 8 calendar years would mean that a teacher wouldn't be able to use that 8th year, which would span potentially across the academic year, right?
There should be a total of 8 years, and within those 8 years, you get your 4 however you want to use
So
them.
what I'm asking about is the distinction of a calendar year versus an academic year here, so that within 8 calendar years, if a student graduates in, let's say, I don't know, March, let's say there's a non-traditional graduation, their 8 years would start in that March. They would not have completed that 8th year if that was their final qualifying year.
I see what you're saying. If they could begin in a year, but not complete the academic year, and then it wouldn't count.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Is that
I don't think we've interpreted it that way, but.
I think I know what she's asking, but I don't know that it's ever.
So maybe adding some language about if you begin a qualifying year of service prior to the 8 years elapsing, you can receive credit for it as long as it's within, I'm just making this up on the fly, but something like
no,
that
I know
would.
what you mean. Yeah.
We'll take a look at it and see if this should be adjusted in some way.
Okay.
So if we want to make a note that, then we'll take a look at that. You want to repeat for him?
Oh, sure. So you can just, it's the reference to 8 calendar years at the end of B1.
See where it says, it all ends up being one sentence. So see where it says within 8 calendar years and dash? Like,
Oh, I see it.
Yeah. So we're going to look at that.
Oh, just a comment.
Yeah.
And what does that mean in terms of next steps? So the department's going to take a look at it and then decide whether we should.
What language, if we need to adjust the language there.
Okay.
We're not sure if this has ever come up. What we're
This does pertain to some of the data requests in terms of that would be relevant to as we're thinking about future looking regulations. I anticipate that very few, if any, have made it to the end of their 8 years and then faced conversion, but I've requested that in a data request as well.
And I, to kind of reinforce that, I do think it would be unfortunate for a student who begins service in a qualifying year in that 8th year, and then just because of the way it landed, then they get converted.
So just to clarify, I think what you're talking about is, say, someone who is a December graduate, and say they started their 4th year in September, but that school year wouldn't be over until after the end of the 8 calendar. I think that's just to clarify.
That is correct.
Could we just use the language of the statute? It just says years. It doesn't say academic or doesn't say calendars for the 8. Then I don't think the intent is trying to catch people in that situation. And I think adding the word calendar could do that. So if it just strike it.
Within the eighth year, right? And just for editing purposes.
And it would solve the problem of this. Yeah, we'll take a look at that language and see that it works, if it works. Yeah, that you're absolutely correct. That's not the intent, and it would make no sense. Okay. And the rest of it, exclusive of this, was the rest of the language we tightened up the language. I think we still reflect the same concepts that we had previously wanted to have there, but if any other additional edits might be needed, then we would want to know that. Okay, it's 10:27. I propose, rather than starting into something that will take longer than 3 minutes, we take a break now and then reconvene about 11:15. Question?
I can bring it up when we get back, but I'm just wondering if this is this spot where we want to address the transfer question, because there was the transfer language there. But
Oh, okay.
We can do that
We
after
can go
break.
back. Yeah, okay, sure, definitely. Yeah, we're gonna take our break and then return to that once we get back.
who explained that there is no funding available for subcommittee members that will be reporting back to the main committee members. So I'll have to pay for travel out of pocket. At this point, I wish that had been communicated during the first subcommittee session, because now the difference in airfare is significant. And so I will hopefully be booking travel. But I don't know how prohibitive that may be to some of the other subcommittee members that will also be reporting back. I do know that it will be a strain for me personally to pay for that.
Thank you. So, all right, we stopped with the beginning of the agreement to serve or repay, and we are now going to move into the next pieces of that. So starting with number 2.
Can we take a look at the transfer language?
Oh, that's right, transfer language. Okay. What would you like to add to that?
Well, I'm just,
Oh, we're still back on the same one. See where it says transfer students, I'm sorry.
and I think that there may potentially be language further in. However, this is just another spot where it appears to indicate that a student could reset the service clock should they transfer. And again, I'm okay with that. If we want to leave it that way, that's fine. I just want to make sure I'm understanding, because that then becomes an important piece of counseling, especially at time of separation.
Is there anyone who thinks that would not be a good solution?
It's just different.
Yeah,
That's
no,
why
totally.
I'm pointing it out, because I
And
would definitely be talking about that with my students who leave for any reason.
Absolutely, and I think that's a great point to bring up. I'm just curious about if we're in agreement that is a good proposal, or if there is anyone who does not think that that's a good idea.
And I do want to clarify here that this is really getting at the idea of one service obligation for your undergraduate teacher grants. So we do address some of this stuff later a little bit, like you say, but it's not really, I don't think it's intended in the same kind of way that you're saying it.
Then I do think we need to clean up the language, because it does say, or 8 years after completing at the transfer institution, and it does
So
not
how
address
would
that any
we-
gap in
yes.
enrollment.
So how would we add, what would we add?
Well, but doesn't this turn on whether or not we agree that, I mean, we do have to decide whether or not we add an arrow related to the teach eligible program to clarify when the clock starts. So
I get my question then goes to the department. Is it your intention that if a student stops at an institution without completing, therefore they cannot teach for, I'm just going to use 2 years for the example, for 2 years, do they use a part of that service timeline without requesting any type of suspension?
And are they actually coming back and then going into a teach-eligible program?
Yes, at a different institution. They go to a different institution, finish a teach-eligible program.
I think the answer is no.
So then what's written there is not accurate.
Reflective. So we'll take it back and we will.
Yeah, I think we'll have to tweak it. I actually think that transfer, that was in response to a comment. I think we got in, and I think that the idea was, this was talking about someone who maybe immediately transferred from school A to school B.
I think we wouldn't need to address that, because they would have nearly continuous enrollment, and they wouldn't be impacted in any way if it was a seamless transfer without any break in time.
And there is a separate regulation that deals with that circumstance specifically.
Yeah.
But this gap issue is a separate issue.
Now that it's written.
Yeah, and I think also I strongly agree that it's a good policy position that the department would allow the 8-year clock if a student re-enrolls, that there would be a retroactive suspension and the clock would begin once they finish their second program.
And this accomplishes that.
And this does. And so with regards to that, to the extent that the department is saying, no, that's not what they intended, I am curious about whether or not you would reconsider that position and what the consensus is of the rest of the committee.
Yeah, I don't think that's what the no is.
No, we're not resetting, we're not giving a suspension. If you withdraw and then maybe a year or two goes by and you go back to school, it could be either the same school or another school, and you are in another teach grant eligible program, it's another undergraduate program. The concept here is that you have one service obligation associated with all the grants you got for undergraduate study. So we don't retroactively grant a suspension. What we do is restart the clock so that it would begin when you finish your. That's what we're proposing. But
So any
I
grant
think I
they
see
would
what you-
use at the transfer institution would have a full 8 years after they were done.
Yes,
But the
because
grant that
you
they
have
used,
one service
which is what,
obligation.
but that's the concept we're used to currently.
Yeah, you have one service obligation for all grants associated with undergraduate
Right.
study, is
So-
the concept.
Are you saying that by introducing that language, it confused it? Is that what we're saying?
We're talking about a different circumstance. We're not talking about a student who is going through their undergraduate degree. We're talking about a student who has a gap, who receives a Teach grant, leaves the institution, goes to a second institution, enrolls in a Teach grant eligible program, finishes their program there. They would have had their 8-year clock begin after they ceased enrollment at the initial program. What we're asking is
If they use Teach there.
if they use
Which
teacher,
we're assuming
exactly.
that they did.
So yeah, exactly. And if they restarted a second program, does that first 8-year clock gets either suspended or does it restart
It
at the
restarts,
termination
and
of the
that's
second
reflected,
program?
it restarts when they leave the second program.
Right, so it's not
and
a
that's
suspension,
reflected
it's
in
a
the regulation.
restart.
It's a restart.
But-
That's great. That is great.
But I think to clarify what you just said, the terminology you just used, one service obligation, would help clarify.
And we do have that language.
Yeah, we do have that
elsewhere.
elsewhere.
but we
It's
may
just
need
not addressed
to-
here.
But I think maybe there's some confusion about that transfer student language in a couple of other places, and we need to go back and look at that.
So
Right,
let's-
because I do think without that added understanding, then anyone who stopped out for a moment, it would benefit them to transfer rather than return to their home
Right,
institution.
right. I see what you're saying. So let's make a note that we will look at this language and try to capture the idea of, that we just, what we just discussed.
But I also think that we're in agreement that starting the clock
Yeah,
at
resetting.
the end and resetting the clock is a good proposal. So we would want that preserved. We just want to make it clear
Yeah,
that you
that
can
that
do
is
that
what
and you
will show up
re-enroll.
later on.
And now that I know
Or-
that, I think I want to add verbiage to because I don't think that's explained in entrance counseling, and I think it should, and well, maybe even more poignant at exit counseling, because I don't think that's clearly communicated anywhere currently.
So when we get to the.
Yeah, I'll think of it, and
Yep.
that was just I was
No, that's good.
thinking out loud.
It could fit in, this would require some behind-the-scenes dot connecting, but it could fit well in the annual notification for folks who didn't complete the program to let them know that they could go back and finish their credential or their degree, I should say. And
I don't think it needs any, we could just say, if you didn't finish your degree, you have this amount of time with which to do that, and then therefore everybody would get the same disclosure.
Sophia, you used the word reset,
Yes.
but the word before was restart, and to me those
Okay.
mean different things. I'm assuming we're talking about resetting, not restarting. Is that correct?
I would say resetting. I don't think there's not much of a difference. I don't.
Well, because restart to me means that you started, and then there's a stopwatch, and then you have a gap, and then it starts again at the point it
no,
stopped
then
at.
it's a reset.
It's a reset. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So what did we say? Did we say restart anywhere? Or because I said it verbally.
No,
Oh.
I think Ed had said. I think others were using the term restart, and I think you use reset. And I think we're talking about reset,
Yeah.
but I just to me they're different concepts.
Okay,
so.
gotcha. All right.
But so I think that's a really important clarification. So we're saying that whatever time is lost during the gap is lost when the person finishes the second Teach grant eligible program that they re-enroll in.
What do you mean by loss?
So, okay.
I don't think that's right, but I just want to be sure that I.
Little box. Okay. So they begin here. Okay. They
Yeah.
go for 2 years.
Yep.
They receive a Teach grant. Okay. They drop out without finishing this program
No.
for 3 years due to financial hardship. There are any number of circumstances that would cause a student to do that. Then they say, I'm going to finish my program. And they re-enroll again. And they get another Teach grant. And here,
I have to ask the question now, or even if they don't,
That's
they
also
wouldn't be
true.
signing a new agreement to serve.
So here, now they graduate. What happens to this 3-year period in relation to the 8-year period? My understanding of what you were saying initially is that the 8-year period starts here and ignores this period. But what I'm hearing you to say, I think, is that like a stopwatch that has started and stopped, they would lose that 3-year period. Is that?
That's why they were.
No, what I'm saying is that's why it's important to say reset or restart. Reset, which is I think what we're talking about, is the 8-year starts at where you have the word grad. If it's restart, then in fact you'd only have 5 years from that point.
That's the
Oh, good.
difference. he's
Okay, because
describing.
I was interpreting the reset language.
You were opposite.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So thank you for
Yeah.
clarifying that. Okay.
Now,
Great.
what about the question if they don't use Teach Grant in that second enrollment period? However, they're still completing a degree that allows them to fulfill any service level, meaning they're still in a program, but they just choose not to use the Teach Grant for whatever reason.
Or
I think
Yeah.
that the issue is we wouldn't know that they were back in a Teach Grant eligible program. The only way we would know is if they got a Teach Grant. But,
But if they're not, we wouldn't know.
so,
But you would know that they re-enrolled in the same program.
Yeah.
but what if it's not the same?
That's what we're saying.
But the outcome would have to still be the same. We're not saying that they don't have to teach in a required program or a required area. So they still have to achieve that.
Well, and the change was, so we got rid of enrollment in program, and now it's just enrollment in institution. And that's the important change.
And further, somebody who uses a Teach Grant in that first, I love your drawing, I'm going to refer to it, in that first area, but then becomes ineligible, maybe because of GPA, they can still achieve the agreement to serve or repay, just as this person could if they didn't use Teach Grant in that second reentry period.
Do we need to get the language for the transfer, the transfer specific language to be able to add these provisions to it? Because
And I'm also wondering if we even need transfer-specific language. If we're not treating transfers any differently, then why do we even have it?
I think it's because the language includes both exit and completion in terms of the beginning of the 8-year service clock, and I think that wrinkle is what would bring in the transfer students because
I
of
wonder
the
if we
exit
can
language.
fix it at that point then, rather than have this
okay.
crazy robust transfer stuff.
It seems like it only becomes relevant if we're talking repayment as it relates to the service. And that was why I said, if that's the case, then either we strike this altogether or we need to use the one service language here. Because then that would also answer your payment or repayment.
I mean, the secondary question, like the difficulty here is that the secondary scenario is, hold on, okay. So let's say you have a student who goes to undergrad, okay, and it's Teach Grant. They use Teach Grant money to pay for their undergraduate degree. They take a 3-year or a 2-year break. And then they go to get their graduate degree. Okay? And they use the Teach Grant. So a similar like gap scenario where you also have this question of an
It's
8-year
different.
period begins here.
That's different because
Yeah.
And then
you've
you
got two
have
different
extension.
academic levels now.
Yeah.
It's not.
The difference is the academic level.
So that one is,
So this is clear. This is okay.
in my mind, yes. But I could also see now how that adds a layer of confusion for students.
Yes. So we would have an 8-year period that would begin here, and then a secondary 8-year period that would begin here, or sorry, not here.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
There.
once they're
Yeah.
done,
Oops.
yes.
Yeah. Where they could overlap, but if this takes, let's say, 3 years, then what?
The only thing I will say is usually in that situation, at least with my students, they're still teaching when they're doing that grad degree. In fact, we have a grad program that only has courses in summer and winter so they could be full-time and accommodate that.
So we've been sitting here trying to talk a little bit amongst ourselves here too, because there's an issue of what does the department know based on what's going on. We don't know how we would know what we don't know and can't find out. If you see what I'm trying to say. So we want to go back and think about whether there is some way that it's possible to do that, and then we'll get back to you and see what is possible, if anything is possible, because there's an issue there of knowing.
But I also think because of how quickly conversions were occurring during the previous period, I mean, they were in the proposal I circulated, there are visuals of how quickly these grants were converting. So in theory, if we remove the paperwork obligations, this is a novel issue because we had Teach Grant recipients that were converting as soon as they left their initial institution. We had folks that were converting and not knowing that they had to represent and report to the department within 120 days. Or that they even had to submit the annual certification on top of the 120 day
I
certification.
think, though, we've fixed that by removing that requirement for the students' action.
Oh, totally.
So I don't think we'll see that anymore.
Well, so what I'm saying is if we're relying on past data as an indication of whether or not these circumstances are true, the past data would not reflect it because people wouldn't even be getting to this point.
We're just saying we want to take a look at that and see what's possible. That's all. Okay. Did that sufficiently?
No, but I think we'll probably have to return to
Well,
it.
we'll return to it
Yeah.
for sure.
Can we add a note that just flags?
Yeah, I was going to say, I can't tell what the comments are there. We have, yeah.
The students leaving and returning?
So we're not doing reset, we're using restart, we're using reset. That was one of the things we want to add to that. And then we want to add that the department's going to look at how we can get certain information related to students coming back in not necessarily in a Teach Grant eligible program. And not necessarily a Teach Grant eligible. I would just say not a Teach Grant eligible program.
Or further, even if it was a Teach Grant eligible program, if the student was subsequently not eligible for whatever reason, however, was still able to fulfill that agreement to serve when they've completed, I think that should capture that as well.
Okay, let's put that.
Can't you type anything? I've had a lot of coffee today. You know, it wouldn't necessarily have to be a Teach Grant eligible program that they re-entered into. I know that sounds crazy, but you can still receive a job that would still allow you to complete, especially given the first agreement to serve and the institutions and stuff that were listed at the time. So, however, it could just be that the student may not be eligible for the Teach Grant. Does that make sense?
Student ineligibility arises, maybe?
Yeah.
Or student becomes ineligible is what you're really saying. The GPA dropped under the circumstances or whatever.
But if they can still fulfill the ATS, I think
Down the road, right? Because that could really happen.
Yes.
Okay. Any other points to this?
That also accounts for students who take like 6 years to complete their undergraduate degree as well, which I think is really good.
Okay.
So I actually have something before we move on, but it's not a big deal. I hope, anyway. Let me say, I hope it's not a big deal. In 3I, under this particular sort of transfer language, and I'm referring, it's page 11. 3I says, as a highly qualified teacher, and I would like that to reference the definition here in the reg, because as defined in CFR, blah, 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 because otherwise that definition doesn't necessarily exist. So
Okay.
just to be very specific, referring back to meeting the criteria here.
So we refer back to, it's the definitions. So it's
6862. And then, yeah. B, definition 8.
So it's 6.8, so it's going to be 686.28 in the comment.
A or eight?
Eight.
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 So we're set 7 right here, right?
Well, no, we're back in the agreement to serve. And where we go, yeah, 686.12, and, yeah, and then where we go to, where it says highly qualified on the next page, I think, yep. Under, in this case, Romanet 3.
Or is it
Right ab-
3?
Yeah, no,
Sorry.
it's 3, right
I see
above,
too.
above, where it says, as a highly qualified teacher as defined in 686.28.
Oh, okay.
I think I have that right.
Thank you.
So I appreciate the abundance of caution and clarity there, but is it needed? Because then every time a term is used, we refer back to the definition of terms. I mean, I feel like it's like every time highly qualified is used in this regulation, it's as defined within the definitions section. So to me, it's unnecessarily repetitive. I get the what you're trying to get at. I just don't know if it's needed because we don't reinforce that with every other term that's in that definitions list.
Would you be okay with striking that?
I mean, I hear you. Let me think on it. I'm not sitting in opposition to your words. I'm just I'm erring on caution based on things that have happened in interpretations of those two words. Sorry. Can we just pause on that and I'll ponder it and maybe come back to it maybe even this afternoon? Is that, yeah.
Okay.
I also haven't gone through to see how many times it's listed there, so.
So, but now we get into a whole bunch of different things. When we look at 2, there's a comment attached to it. So let me just kind of step back here for a second. We went through all this and renumbered things, reworded things, if there was a need to reword minor things, and also we did this through 5. So new 5, which is in the red line, and then. We also removed annual certification date requirement because the grant recipient will no longer be required to submit an annual certification. So that was struck. I'm trying to find out where that was struck. Right there, number 2. So we struck that there. So what I want to propose is that we take a look at the language that we see here. We can look at it in red line or we can look at it in clean language, but the red line here is kind of clean, so it makes it clear where the language is. Through 5, which is above, it takes us basically to completion of more than one service obligation, but it's just these pieces here now. So, the STEM we're requiring the grant recipient to submit, upon completion of each year of service, documentation of the service in the form of a certification by a chief administrative officer of the school. Explains that the 8-year period for completing a service obligation may be extended through periods of suspension in accordance with 686.41. Explains the condition under which a teach grant may be converted to a direct unsubsidized loan, as we've described in 686.43. I know we haven't gotten to these things yet, but this is what it's going to refer to. Explains that if a teach grant is converted to a direct unsubsidized loan, the grant recipient must repay the loan in full with interest charged from the date of each teach grant document, and explains that to avoid further accrual of interest as described in paragraph B4, a grant recipient who decides not to teach in a qualified school or field, or who for any other reason no longer intends to satisfy the service obligation may request that the secretary convert his or her teach grant to a direct unsubsidized loan that the grant recipient may begin repaying immediately instead of waiting for the teach grant to be converted to a loan under the condition described in 686 point, which we'll get to that part down the road. This refers to the whole emphasis language we had made into this, kept the concept. And then finally requires the grant recipient to comply with the terms, conditions, and other requirements that are consistent with 686.402.3 that the secretary deems to be necessary. So I'll just let everybody take a look at that and see how you feel about this now. And I think we're okay not having the clean version up. I think it's clean enough, right? I hear nothing. In that case, let's move on to C. And we did edit language here.
Actually,
And
I'm
go ahead.
sorry. I do have something I'm just thinking through, and maybe you can help me clarify. So in 2, the highlighted section there, as we're thinking about sort of implementation of this section here, so it says requires the grant recipient to submit upon completion of each year of service documentation of the service. I guess I'm wondering, because I know that the department had talked about that a grant recipient would be able to sort of go back and document in some way that they completed their year of service, even if there's sort of no deadline, and maybe that's the way they're.
So you're saying 4, instead of saying requires a grant recipient to submit upon completion, you're saying for each year of service. Is that what you're trying to say?
No, I'm
No.
just.
I think it might be, instead of at the completion of each year, to say, to submit it for each year of service.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
I think that's what you're saying.
And I have to, I have another question regarding to the problem, and that would be how, if a student who began their degree and didn't finish prior to the expiration of the 8-year period, what would we do then?
I'm sorry, I wasn't listening to that. I was just being reminded
I'm
that
bringing
actually
up
that's
other-
statutory language, even though practically speaking it becomes for.
It is statutory language, and isn't that what brought upon the problem of early conversions in the first place?
I will also say this, so that is the statutory language. What constitutes the completion of each year is left to the department to define. So it
So
could
we fixed it later. when
Yeah,
we-
and so of completion of each year, I think it's deliberate that there's not a deadline, because when you go back to the statute, it looks as the statute states that the grant should only be converted if the grant recipient refuses to or cannot satisfy the service requirement. So it's actually good that they're encouraged to submit at the completion of each year, but they're not penalized if they do not do it, because they should still have the opportunity to do it prior to conversion under the statute. So, yeah, but
Now, I have a different question, concern. It's almost as if we are allowing for an 8-year period to begin the agreement to serve obligation, given the fact that we are resetting the clock if they finish their program and then begin to complete their years of service. So my question then is, some of these programs are very lengthy, and some students, based on whatever can't finish them even within their defined time frame of 4 or 5 years. So what happens to the student who starts, and again I'm going to refer to her diagram, starts in the Teach Grant program and uses Teach Grant, stops out for a while, goes back to school, and is tracking on a time frame with which to complete, but the 8-year period expires prior to completion of that program? I guess they're not really receiving the same benefit. And that may be the intention, but I think, again, that incorporates some confusion. And that's why I'm bringing it up, because it disadvantages some, it helps some, but it disadvantages others.
By having the clock reset when they complete?
No, I'm asking what happens. She's got it right there.
So, like, for example, they spend 3 years in an undergraduate program. They have a gap of 3 years. They return and spend 4 years to complete an undergraduate program. And they also receive Teach Grant money somewhere within that 4 years. Yeah, just to make it easy. So you have a 10-year period where they're enrolled, and the 8-year period wouldn't begin until here.
However, their first Teach Grants would have converted during all of that time.
That's what we were just trying to get at, is how,
Yeah.
what the real, yeah. Do you want to speak to that? No? I'm looking at the operational people sometimes.
But I still think that the initial proposal, that should they not re-enroll at this point, then yeah, this 3-year clock had elapsed, right, is elapsing. If they do re-enroll and complete the program, then it erases that time and it would restart. I mean, I think
So it's disparate, though, for students who, just based on timelines, try
Yeah.
to finish and I mean, it's a lot of money that we're talking about. That's why I bring it up.
I agree, and also if there's any, so let's say they do 3 years, they get into a qualifying teaching position in between, in that gap period, what happens to those service years if their clock, in theory, hasn't begun until the end of this period?
That's another complicating question.
Which may be another place where we can talk about suspension.
But those 3 years, if they haven't completed a program, they would, in order for those 3 years to count, they would have to have achieved getting full certification, because by definition, you can't be provisionally, emergency, or temporarily certified.
So in
it's
order
not- they
to
probably
speak
wouldn't
to her point,
qualify.
then she would probably be talking about graduate students, because they could still be teaching while going back for another program. So the problem you bring up is probably more prevalent in the graduate world, not the undergraduate, because of the fact that it would be difficult for them to start service years. So is that where we're leaving it? It's just that the student better hurry up and get back in their program?
Well, unless somebody wants to propose additional language and to think about, I think we'll leave it there for now.
So just to be clear, I think you're talking about a situation where somebody, say they go to school for 2 years and they get Teach Grants and they drop out for whatever reason, but they don't go back to school for 6 years. And in that period of time, they don't do any teaching at all. They would have already been converted because they run out of time. What we've written here doesn't really contemplate
I
that,
agree,
and
but
I'm
now
not sure-
consider this: a student who goes to school for 3.5 years and then stops out for 6 years, for 6 years. They could have the chance to go back to school, finish, and achieve grant status, whatever, while the other student wouldn't. And that situation is the same. They didn't finish. They went back. I mean, it just seems a little odd.
I mean, it's the question of how long is this gap period? If the gap period is longer than 8 years, then yeah, and if they have no, or longer than 5 years, and they haven't demonstrated any service, then you have an issue. But in theory, if they go back, that resets their service clock.
And
So
further,
none
I
of it
also
should
have to bring
convert.
up that this is going to be extremely difficult for servicers to track, I think.
That's why I was saying they wanted to propose language.
Well, that was why I brought up earlier about us identifying clearly the application and receipt of the first grant of your once you get eligible, because then you also run into the problem on the back end, whichever way we look at it.
So if the committee wants to propose some language for us to look at, we'd be happy to do that. I'm not saying
I mean, I
that-
have some
I mean,
ideas, but I'm not
Just
a,
the issues, we
really a
can't
drafter.
predict what people are going to do. Somebody drops out of school, we have no way of, 4 or 5 years go by, we don't have any way of predicting whether somebody's
This is
going
the
to
we
go back
don't
to
know what
school.
we
But
don't
if
know
you've got
piece.
suggestions for how we might write the regulations to try to accommodate
Well, I think
some of
you
these
do know, and
situations.
the servicers would know if somebody started back in school. And as long as a person always has the right to voluntary conversion, it almost seems like we could trigger that
Well, no,
clock, so to
What I'm saying
speak.
is that if you get to the point, you drop out of school and you don't do any teaching at all, and you get your 8-year clock starts, and you get to the point where you've run out of time to do it, you'd be converted, and you're saying, well, what if that person was planning to go back to school?
So
But
then,
we're actually raising a distinct situation from that it wouldn't be a complete elapse of the 8-year clock, that they would be re-enrolling within their 8-year period, which then, in theory, would restart the 8-year period at the completion of that program, if I'm understanding correctly. We're not saying that
Right.
they're waiting for 8 years to re-enroll. We're saying within that 8-year period, they're re-enrolling.
right, and I mean, I guess we might have to think about how to define when they, because if they re-enroll on 7 years and 364 days, like, what's a reasonable time frame for that?
This is true. I will also say, in lieu of presenting true regulatory language, in the past, subcommittees have submitted proposals where they raise the issue for the subcommittee, they propose a solution, and then the committee will vote on whether or not that proposal should be adopted by the department. And maybe this is one of those areas where that may be a better, especially so that you can illustrate these very specific examples that may apply to a wide number of students and large number of students, but that's hard to peg down in the regulatory language
Yeah, and
right now.
I don't know of any place I could get the data even.
I would say on that point, I would like, in my personal preference, for this subcommittee to produce out as many sort of recommendations and leave less to the full committee, simply because the full committee has so many different issues on the plate that to the extent that we are able to hash them out ourselves as sort of the designated subject matter experts on this, I think would be best, particularly because of just the sheer volume of issues, and I'm sure the full committee probably won't have an opportunity to fully digest all of the various issues in front of them.
So I guess I'm just trying to narrow down if we want to leave it as you have 8 years with which to either fulfill your ATS or re-enroll and finish. Or if we want to somehow expand it differently. Because right now I think currently we have it, you have 8 years to complete your agreement to serve or re-enroll and finish. Because at that point your clock would then start again. Restart. Reset. Yeah. But do you see what I mean? And there's a definite difference there. So I think we need to figure out how we're going to move that forward.
Is there an expectation on when, between the 90 and 120 day notice before conversion, that something is either triggered or that there's a response as it relates to
No,
restart?
also
That
I
could
think
be
that would
used
be that would
in
happen
instance, but-
regardless of as because they're always going to be tracking towards some sort of conversion point, and so that would just sort of trigger on its own.
But maybe the concept of approaching this from a notification angle, that, just so you know, if you do plan to go back to school, or you can plan to go back to school, and the clock will reset, instead of trying to think of,
I mean, I think that's why we're talking about it
Yeah.
in
No,
the
you're-
in
yeah.
the agreement to serve. But so I think it is, if you drop out, you have 8 years to fulfill your ATS, or maybe like 5 years to re-enroll, or 6 years to re-enroll and complete your program. At which point the 8-year clock will begin, running.
I think to do it that way would be difficult because you'd have to define re-enrollment, and then there's sort of this open-ended new time frame based on enrollment status and program, and
Okay.
I think that way would be more difficult. I'm kind of landing on you have 8 years with which to complete your ATS and or finish and start your obligation. I think that's more liberal than what we've had in the past, and I think it still has this construct of being unfair to certain people who maybe make that decision later, but at some point we have to confine We have to confine it somewhere.
Okay. To reroll.
So I'm trying to figure out, did we reflect this accurately in here?
It may need to be a separate numerette.
I was going to say, where do we want, where should we put this?
I don't know.
Is it really 5 and then we have 6 as, or is it under 4, the conditions? Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, probably.
So what we're saying is we have 8 years to the limit is 8 years. You either complete your agreement to serve or you reapply.
So we would no longer convert you at the point where you
What?
no longer.
One here. Why don't you go ahead and ask?
No.
No? Okay.
I'm still not sure exactly what we're proposing, I think.
So without,
I think an example would help. It always helps me to have an example of what
well, I
you're
think
trying
without
to do.
properly framing this, it becomes, as you can see, very confusing and difficult to navigate, even when talking about examples. So I guess I was trying to figure out how Ed perceived this new reset. And without framing it, I think it becomes a little loose and difficult to understand. So all I was saying is that maybe we should have it indicated somewhere in here that a student has 8 years with which to complete the agreement to serve or complete a program that allows them to begin completing the years of service. That was choppy because I'm just sort of flying out of my mouth, but because with this new concept of reset, it just needs to be properly.
But are you really
laid
talking
out.
about a teach-eligible program? I mean, that wouldn't be just any
Yeah.
program that would allow them to complete the years of service.
See, and I think we need to stay away from teach-eligible program because of the
It has
issue.
to be a teach grant eligible program.
Right.
Right,
We
but
don't
remember
necess-
now they did
right.
sign, and I also don't think they have to use teach grants later on because they already signed an agreement to serve for their first program. So whatever the eligible programs were listed at that time may be different than this time around. So I would like to avoid using teach eligible program as well as saying that they have to use a teach grant in the future, just as long as they can, if they achieve a program that allows them to begin completing their agreement to serve, that's when it resets.
Are you, right now, what we're proposing here now, and this is actually in the current regulations, is the triggers for leaving aside the people who voluntarily convert, that you would convert if you don't begin teaching, say 4 years go by and you haven't done any teaching at all, conversion happens right then. Are you proposing we eliminate that and say you just don't? I was thinking maybe that's where you were going.
I'm not proposing that. I thought that's how you guys explained this new reset.
Well, when we proposed this language about grant recipients who withdraw and then re-enroll, I don't know that we contemplated people who waited so long to re-enroll that would have run out of time. That's maybe another wrinkle we didn't really think about that here. So
But I think that's what we're trying
one approach
to-
might be
to
to say
fix.
that this would apply, provided that if we keep that current conversion trigger, one approach might be to say this would apply provided that you re-enroll in another teach grant eligible program before you get to the point where you'd be converted under that conversion rule. That
Which
would
is
be
what
one
that's what I
criteria.
said.
Is that what I just?
Yes, that's what I
you're
said.
saying.
So
Okay. So in other words, if you withdraw from school and you don't go back to school until 5 years later, you would have already had your grants, and you didn't do any teaching, you would have already had your grants converted, assuming you didn't get a suspension.
well, that's not what we heard. We heard that if you completed the program prior to the elapse of the 8 years, that the clock reset. So what would we do with that prior
But you would have
conversion?
been converted before, because that's why I asked the question asked whether you were proposing we eliminate that trigger, because the trigger, right, as it's written right now, is you would be converted if you fail to begin or maintain qualifying service within a period that would allow you to complete it within the 8 years. So you withdraw from school, you don't start teaching, you don't get a suspension. A little more than 4 years goes by, you no longer have time to do the 4 years within the 8 year period. So if your grants are going to be converted right then. So what I'm suggesting is we could modify this to say that this withdrawal and re-enrollment language, these provisions would apply as long as you re-enrolled in another teacher grant eligible program before you hit the point where you've run out of time.
So I think along those lines, the point would be, so if you assume they've completed 4 years, we're now in the 5th year, they have submitted no service documentation.
They've completed 4 years of...
4 years, no, just 4 years have elapsed in the service year clock. We're now within the 5th year. The 5th year would be the last permissible period for them to re-enroll in a teach grant eligible program to restart their service clock after completion of that program. That is what I think I'm hearing you say.
And that's just another way to further confine it, which,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm fine with that. And again, it
Well,
provides
but
more
we
leniency
reset
than
the-
we've had in the
reset the
past.
clock,
Yeah.
we still have
So,
a
I mean,
year
if they
to
think that that's something that's
re-enroll.
important,
So
then
4 years would be the...
I mean, I think
it still
What about
provides the,
just-
go ahead.
Sorry. What about just allowing a grant recipient to express before the grant is converted that they do intend to at some point re-enroll, and then you sort of leave it at that, so that if they do complete the program, so then conversion would be suspended in some way, and so then at the other side of it, you know, if you were to, it would sort of put the onus on the grant recipient instead of the servicer to calculate exactly out, you know, exactly if your program will be completed in this X amount of time, but if, that's sort of what I'm thinking.
I don't think the intent here is that the servicer would have to say, you know, how long you have to complete the program. It's that if you are in the 5th year, you can't complete your service obligation.
Right, but if you do re-enroll and complete your program, then is our intent as a group that person then would be eligible or not.
Correct, but I didn't understand why you brought up the servicer having to recalculate.
I sort of took a detour and anticipated some thinking along the lines of, we seem to be trying to figure out numbers here, and if we simply, you know, provide the option to a grant recipient to say that they can if their grant is about to be converted, they can communicate in some way that they do plan to finish their program, and then that conversion can be suspended. Look, it's in the grant recipient's best interest, depending on the grant recipient's circumstances. It's in their best interest to convert right away if they don't plan to, if they can't or don't complete the program because the interest accrual, right? So extending out the time of conversion by expressing their intent to complete a program would simply ensure that they have the opportunity to do that if we are committed to the idea of a reset in any period.
Right, because the only detriment then becomes to the student if they don't fulfill on that promise to finish. Yeah, I would agree with that.
I'm curious though, because you say at some point I'm going to finish, so I could just keep saying to the department over and over and over again, no, really, I'm going to finish this. No, really, I'm going to finish this. No, really, I'm going to finish this, and use that as an avoidance.
Which is why I brought
of
up that
conversion.
you have to complete your agreement to serve and/or finish your program and then start the obligation.
Right. So I think we're all on the same page, except we're trying to make this more complicated than it needs to be. With the notice that goes out, if I recall correctly, 120 days in advance of conversion, then that is a point where it says, hey, you have got to either re-enroll if you're not done, or get ready for this, and just leave it at that, because then we are telling them their options.
That's going to happen at year 4, and somebody could be re-enrolled, and then their grant would convert while they are finishing their program, and that's what we're talking about now.
But at the same time, we do have to hold to this 8 years of the statute. So if that's the case, then, we can't save everybody. I just feel like we're starting to get into where we're starting to step on statutory situations. And so if they're not getting back into school in time to complete their service obligation, then it converts. And so I think we need to stick to the 8-year window and be very clear on that. And that's where we talk about all the counseling and things to ensure it, because this
But
whole.
they've already said that they're willing to do the reset.
And
But I think
That's
statutorily,
in
this
a
does
specific
fall within
circumstance.
I think the reset is not a global reset.
not a global
No,
reset.
the reset is, again, if you would have to re-enroll before you get to the point where you've run out of time.
Right.
And as Deborah said, we're building in notices so that they're going to be told in advance, in so many words, you're running out of time and you've got to do one of these things by this point. And I'm not sure what we can do beyond
But
that.
I actually don't think we're that far out of agreement, right? So they have 8 years to fulfill their agreement to serve, or if they withdraw from a Teach Grant eligible program, they have 6 years from the point of withdrawal, when that 8-year clock would begin, or 5 years from the point of withdrawal to re-enroll and complete the program. And as we have in other, in the suspension provision, once they re-enroll in a Teach Grant eligible program, the clock is suspended anyway. And the clock would not begin until they complete the program or exit again.
Is that right?
I think we need to write that down and look at it.
Yeah.
I also, the reason I was trying to find a copy of the statutes, I want to make sure I had the correct statutory language. Agreement to serve. The applicant will serve as a full-time teacher for a total of not less than 4 academic years within 8 years after completing the course of study. So I think, to Deborah's point earlier, we have to stick with the 8-year. That is statutory, and
But it says after completing the course of
Yeah.
study.
right. But again, there's you can't get there from here thing, like what you were saying before. You have so much time left.
But
And then you
if
don't
it
have-
says serve as a full-time teacher for a total of not less than 4 academic years within 8 years after completing the course of study.
For which the applicant received a teach grant.
Right.
For which so in other words, if you're not receiving a teach grant anymore, you're in a different boat potentially.
But if it's still the same program that they were initially receiving a Teach Grant for, if they're re-enrolling, then it would be fine. The problem would be if they transferred programs, then you're saying the clock would still run, even if they were re-enrolled.
They would have 8 years.
Even if it was still a Teach Grant eligible program.
Well, if they're enrolled, again, received, you're saying because they didn't receive the teach grant?
Right, so I'm saying, let's say
that's what
they
you're
were
saying.
enrolled
Oh,
initially
they
as a special
contemplated that.
education, in a special education program. They dropped out before completing it. They re-enroll in another education program, but now instead of getting their special education master's, they're getting their master's in English language learning. So the English language learning component would not stop the clock under what I think you're proposing.
It says in the statute under which the applicant received a teach grant under this subpart.
Yeah, I don't know that the statutory language really contemplates these
Yeah.
withdrawal and
No.
re-enrollment situations.
Not
So
really.
I'm still unclear on what the differences
How about-
are here. and
how
what we're
about-
proposing.
I mean, I still go back to, like, is it really an issue if they're completing a Teach Grant eligible program and then they complete the service? I mean, the statute allows the department to determine what constitutes completion. The statute also permits the department to determine extenuating circumstances. They have the flexibility on either side to share this reading that if they withdraw, they would have 5 years from the point of withdrawal to re-enroll and complete the program, at the completion of which the 8-year clock would begin. I don't see that as a negative thing. If anything, you're building in solutions for teachers who are struggling to complete their program and allowing them to work in these schools. Like, this is nothing bad.
So our ask is that you provide some draft language for that for me, and John would love examples.
Are you going to work on, or?
I would love to work on it with you.
Okay, that's because I
Okay.
can be really good at providing examples, and I bet you'll be better at drafting language.
That would be great.
Okay.
Okay, so let's put it right. Okay. So, should we move on to completion of more than one service obligation then? Okay. And in this case, I think we probably are better off looking at the clean language because there's an awful lot of strike out here. So let's kind of take these one at a time. And under one, yeah, I can keep, see, you were there. So we took everything we heard last time, and this is how we redrafted to try to reflect that. A grant recipient, this is again completing more than one service obligation. A grant recipient must complete one service obligation for all teach grants received for undergraduate study, discussed this before, and one service obligation for all teach grants received for graduate study, same concept. Each service obligation begins when the grant recipient ceases enrollment at the institution where the teach grants were received, or in the case of
I'm just flagging that in our proposed language, we'll be proposing a new, probably subsection or numerette, as well as amending the language in C.
okay, so
Actually, the verbiage that follows seems to indicate that you're going to reset the clock no matter what, because it doesn't mention completion. It just says that if you re-enroll, the secretary adjusts the starting date for completing. Yeah,
okay.
it just says that you will adjust it regardless. It does not mention completion. It says upon enrollment.
But there is a separate regulation about conversion that says if you run out of time, you get converted. So that would supersede this in some cases. You
So
would,
we've got
if you
conflicting
wait.
information in regulation then?
Well,
But it wouldn't supersede
It says
because
unless
it's
par-
conflicting regulations.
unless paragraph C3 of this section applies.
Yeah, that's about a different issue.
Oh, okay.
But there's a separate rule for conversion to loans that says you'll be converted if you haven't begun teaching within a time frame that would allow you to. So if you reach that point and you maybe haven't even thought about re-enrolling in school, then your grants are going to be converted to loans, and this wouldn't apply. But what we talked about earlier was maybe clarifying this language to make it explicit that you would have to re-enroll before you hit that point. But I think you guys are going to perhaps suggest something a little different. That's what you're going to work on.
I mean, if
Actually,
you're
I think
in,
this language is problematic even outside of that problem.
but also if that is your interpretation of subsection 4 or regulation 43, then I think we're going to have to rework the language in section 43 to account for students that leave a program and re-enroll. Because if it's communicated here one way and that is not consistent with how you're interpreting section 43, then there would be students who would comply for all intents and purposes and would still get their grant converted if you're saying no, the 8-year clock begins and starts regardless of what we said in other regulations.
Right, and if you read the
No.
paragraph at the top of page 12, top of page 12, it says that you're going to reset the clock based on re-enrollment, not completion.
That's also because the
No.
clock starts when you sign the agreement to serve.
Oh, I'm agreeing with you.
No.
I'm saying that this language is
No,
Very
what the intent here is that if you withdraw and then you re-enroll in another teach grant eligible program, the clock that had originally started, that would be stopped. And it would be reset to begin whenever you graduate. But it's not gonna, do you follow me? It wouldn't be
yes,
start,
but
it would no longer, once you re-enroll, you would no longer be.
that actually
in-
solves our problem
Once
and
you
further
once you
complicates the
re-enroll,
issue all at the same time.
once you re-enroll, you'd no longer be in your service obligation because that would have been stopped. And so, but we don't know when you're.
I mean, this is great.
Right,
This is
so-
But the
Interesting.
conversion piece stays in, so the clock is still there. If you don't re-enroll, correct me where I'm wrong.
Yes.
If you don't re-enroll before that, the year 5, I guess we'll
Yes.
call it that, then in year 5 you convert. So
Yes.
this is not a blanket because of the conversion language that comes up later.
Yes.
You have that 5-year, and that's where I think we need to be sure to say, hey, in the 120-day notice or whatever, PS, you could re-enroll and go complete, and your clock will reset.
And this is not just re-enrollment, it's re-enrollment and receives additional teach grants.
Well, we want to go back and take another look at that because
And it's interesting because this clearly says that you're going to recalculate the clock when they re-enroll.
No, re-enroll
So-
and receive additional teach grants.
Right, so you're re-enrolling in a teach grant eligible program.
And
That's
receiving
when the
teach
clock
grants.
resets. So if you don't re-enroll in a teach grant eligible, your clock
And
does.
receive teach grants.
And receive
Correct,
teach
and
grants.
receive teach grants, then, thank you. Okay, so there's 2. It has to be teach grant eligible and you have to receive teach grants. Then your clock doesn't reset.
Unless you finish and begin your agreement to serve, which we've already discussed. So there's lots of ways now in which your clock can be reset, which is interesting.
But you still have to finish before you're converted.
Right.
So it's all within a certain time frame. I thought that was the issue for everybody.
But the re-enrollment will switch how long that time frame can go. That's one of the issues.
As long as they're re-enrolling in a teach grant eligible program and receiving teach grants, I have no problem with that restarting a clock and stretching it out. But if you just come back in and you're not in a teach grant eligible program and you're not receiving teach grants, then the clock still rolls. Right? Correct? I'm looking at the department.
yeah, certainly if you're not enrolling in a teach grant eligible program.
And receiving teach grants in this
Yeah.
case.
But I also think through our discussion, we've agreed that receiving that secondary teach grant should not be included within the trigger. Am I correct or not? That it should just be that you're re-enrolling in the teach grant eligible program, period.
I would agree with you
Okay,
because the student's eligibility can fluctuate without a break in enrollment.
totally.
Because you're looking for agreement, I'm not going to agree without seeing something in writing.
Yeah,
Oh,
I mean,
that's fine.
I need to,
That's fine.
ponder that one too.
And we can circulate after we have some draft language and vote via email, yada, yada.
Oh, I'm sorry. This piece about receiving additional teach grants, I think both in, yeah, it's in both pieces.
Yeah, because the issue is that we know that you re-enroll in school, but if you don't get another teach grant, we don't have any easy means of knowing that you're back in a teach grant eligible program. That's an issue. But we can talk a little more about that.
Matching SIP
Wow.
codes would be the easy way.
Yeah, but we're not identifying in that way, and because the teach
it's
grant eligible
reported with
programs are
enrollment.
determined at the. As far as I know, we do not have any means right now of knowing that you are in a program that particular institution is designated as a teach grant eligible program, unless you're getting a teach grant.
No, I get it because the school certifies that when they
Right,
certify the
right.
teach grant. But again, if they've done that once, the SIP code would be an indication that it is.
Plus, couldn't the school certify it again if a student re-enrolled that this is still a teach grant program?
I don't think that we would have to because it would be the same SIP code. Like
But
right now,
what
the
if-
way
yeah.
that we indicate to the department that it's a teach eligible program is the origination of the teach grant itself. That's the only way that they know. So if a student that came back to me was GPA ineligible, I still report their enrollment. And it's the same program. And the way that we classify programs is zip code, and they would receive that information.
Okay. And so if they re-enrolled but in a different Teach Grant eligible program,
A different one, they would not know.
they wouldn't know, but the school would know.
We would know.
And so the school could separately certify to the department that they have continued to.
That would be difficult to track. The student would probably have to request that.
Okay.
So we'll take this back and look at it and see what we can come up with. And you've got your assignments on related to this as well. Let's see. I'm trying to think if we have enough time to talk about anything else here before we break for lunch. So under this, unless paragraph C3 applies, is this area where we need to look at the receiving other teach grants. Others will be looking at other things. Under C3, and we can read over this quickly and see if there's any questions that we can address. In the case of a teach grant recipient covered under the above cases, who completed one or more complete academic years of credible teaching service, as described in the agreement to serve during the period between the grant recipient's withdrawal and re-enrollment, the Secretary does not adjust the starting date of the period for completing the service obligation. The completed teaching service counts towards satisfaction of the grant recipient service obligation under paragraph C2I, which is above of this section. And if the grant recipient continues to perform credible teaching service after re-enrolling in a Teach Grant eligible program, the grant recipient may receive credit towards satisfaction of the service obligation under paragraph C2I of this section for any complete academic years of credible teaching service performed while the recipient is concurrently enrolled in a Teach Grant eligible program only if the recipient does not request and receive a temporary suspension of the period for completing the service obligation. A lot of words.
I do. So I see we have 4 minutes before we have to take lunch.
I just want to at least get that out there.
I do. I am still curious about the department's position about why there cannot be a suspension where a person can still receive qualifying service years. I don't see that within the language of the statute, and so I don't understand why it's one or the other instead of both.
Ditto. That was, yeah, that doesn't make sense to me.
Well, in the interest of time, we'll take up that question after lunch. How does that sound? Shall we look at 115 as our target? Okay. Great. We will do that then. Thank you.